Going into the second hour of the nationwide invasion, as Russian maneuver forces had made their way to the perimeter fencing of the Camp Bullis military installation, they had simply smashed their way in to the installation and were now taking on isolated and confused American forces as a result of the tandem anti-satellite and cyber strikes, as well as the local electronic warfare jamming, which was jamming the redundant radio communications, which included the ground-based Russian jamming conducted by their electronic warfare battalion, the 53rd, as well as also the KG-600 electromagnetic jamming pods that were equipped to the JH-7 strike aircraft, or also known as the Flying Leopards, each aircraft capable of carrying nearly 20,000 square pounds of air-to-ground ordnance, as these aircraft had already dropped 80,000 pounds, as 2 pairs out of 3 total pairs of these aircraft dedicated just to Camp Bullis had since dropped their mammoth payloads, in addition to the enormous 300mm rocket strikes, which were hitting a 3 by 3 mile area of the installation in the center of it, as the Tornado S Battalion had simply laid waste to this entire area and all of the 81st Stryker Brigade Combat Team elements that lay within, as well as also 2 full firing battalions of the BM-21 Grad systems, as these BM-21 Grad systems of these 2 firing battalions, which included all of their firing batteries that comprised them, as they had 56 systems in each battalion. Also adding to that, the Serbian 1st Brigade of the Serbian Army, their Morava rocket battalion, which was also 122mm, which added an additional 56 systems, all fired into Camp Bullis, as this enormous destruction was added to by the TOS-1A systems, as these were enormously destructive, fired by the TOS-1A battalion of the 2nd NBCR Protection Regiment, as well as also the Iskander-Ms fired by the firing battalions of the 950th Rocket Brigade that had devoted some of their operations, in terms of firing their missiles, directly into Camp Bullis, as there were various targets that needed to be struck that were of key strategic importance, such as the TOCs that were being attempted to be set up, as well as the actual living areas and other sites, including the training buildings and administrative buildings that were on site at Camp Bullis, as well as also firing into Lackland and firing mostly at Fort Hood, and even a few fire missions that were fired into the Austin Battlespace in support of the 2nd Combined Arms Army forces that were in that area of operations as well. As all of this firepower was enormously destructive, the howitzer battalions, as there were 2 firing battalions dedicated just to Camp Bullis of the 2S19 MSTAs of the 385th Guards Artillery Brigade, as well as also the single firing battalion of the self-propelled Nora B battalion of all of its firing batteries, which added another 56 howitzers to the 112 Russian howitzers of both howitzer battalions that were trained on Camp Bullis, created a level of destruction that was simply unfathomable between the 300mm rockets, 122mm rockets, 152mm mass shelling, as well as also Iskander tactical ballistic missile strikes, and Chinese DH-10 long-range subsonic cruise missile strikes fired from across the border from the reinforced Strategic Missile Forces brigades of the 612th and 613th of the PLA's Eastern Theater Command, as they had been bolstered by additional called-up reserve battalions to fire these widely mass-produced systems, as well as older but well-maintained tactical ballistic missile systems specifically earmarked for some of these battalions to fire. They added an enormous volume of additional firepower to what already was a very high level of missile capabilities within these brigades. The 616th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade, also of the PLA's Eastern Theater Command, deployed as a Trojan unit in eastern Texas, was not reinforced, but, however, even so, they were still able to fire their very modern and highly capable tactical ballistic missiles at multiple different targets located throughout the south-central invasion sector. As all of his firepower converging onto Camp Bullis effectively annihilated whole units, the forces under fire, and also being struck by the 4 JH-7s, in addition to the TOS-1A fires, the 300mm fires, 122mm fires, as well as also, again, all of the howitzer-based firepower, effectively annihilated the 4 present companies of the 549th Military Intelligence Battalion, a reserve battalion that was being mobilized in the process of it, and they were, again, a frequent visitor to the Camp Bullis Military Reservation as they were a local reserve force belonging to the 505th Military Intelligence Brigade, along with all of the 1st of the 185th Infantry Regiment. The 1st of the 185th was a Stryker Battalion, a mechanized infantry battalion, and the 1st of the 82nd Cav was completely wiped out as well by all of this concentrated firepower. Also, so was basically the entirety of the 898th Brigade Engineering Battalion that were not already wiped out by the VVS, as in the attack helo gunships that came in to the combat air landing strip and annihilated the elements of Delta Company as well as also Charlie Company, as Delta was the military intelligence company and Charlie was the signals intelligence company, who were setting up their talks very near where the brigade's HHC had set theirs up. As these were only elements of these companies that belonged to the 898th Brigade Engineering Battalion, which was more like a special troops battalion, as they only had 2 combat engineer companies, their headquarters of headquarters company, as well as also their Charlie and Delta, which were completely different and were not combat engineers, but were signals intelligence and military intelligence forces. The entire 898th was also laid waste to by the highly concentrated artillery fires along with the airstrikes, as these forces were simply wiped out, along with, again, the 4 present companies of the 549th Military Intelligence Battalion, the Reserve Battalion mentioned, all of the 1st of the 185th, all of the 1st of the 82nd Cav, and the 181st Brigade Support Battalion, which Bravo through India companies were within this sector and were completely annihilated by all of the concentrated fire. Only Alpha Company and its headquarters of headquarters company were not destroyed in the 300mm fire, along with all of the concentrated howitzer fire, rocket fires, and the airstrikes, as they were located more on the western end of the installation. As on the eastern end of the installation, where the last Spetznas company was brought in at this point in time, as this was occurring and they had fast roped out of their transport/tac helo gunships to take their positions and begin to recon the area with their quadcopter assets to map the area in real time, along with the high altitude surveillance assets, including even higher altitude like satellites, which were even higher than the high altitude drones, which created a complete total overlay in real time of the entire area. As the Spetznas contributed directly to assisting in this, on this edge of the installation, the maneuver elements were beginning to come in on the western side of the installation. Between this map and the western edge of the installation lay a roughly 3 by 3 mile area that was completely and totally saturated by a concentration of 300mm rocket fires from the Tornado S battalion, all of their systems firing into this area and completely saturating this large area with 300mm fire, as they deliberately concentrated it in this area to avoid harming their own forces that were now moving in on the periphery, as well as holding the airfield in the north, as well as the concentrated 122mm strikes from the 2 Russian BM-21 Grad battalions and the Serbian Morava rocket battalion, also 122mm, also firing into this area, with the 4 of 6 JH-7s dropping 80,000 pounds into this area as well, along with concentrated howitzer fire and even the TOS-1A battalion firing some of its systems into this area also, as they had also fired into the eastern edge of the installation alongside of rocket fires from two companies, one Morava company from the Morava battalion of multiple companies, as well as one company from the BM-21 Grad battalion in this area, along with all of the TOS-1A and 152 strikes from both Russian and Serbian howitzer forces of these different battalions, as there were two Russian howitzer battalions and the one Serbian Nora B battalion of 152mm self-propelled howitzers. All of this firepower was simply immense. As the thermobarics 300mm, 122mm, the Iskander-M's, DH-10As, and 80,000 pounds of HE munitions dropped by JH-7s from the four aircraft that were mentioned, and the concentrated 152mm shelling, any forces in this 3x3 mile area simply ceased to exist, as everything between here and here had been rocketed and annihilated. As in this area, there were some forces who survived by going into the drainage ditches as artillery began to come down and hit the 3rd of the 161st, which was a battalion, and they were hitting their headquarters of headquarters companies' bivouac site, their TOC that they were setting up with their portable buildings with sensitive communications equipment. They were even setting up a mess tent, and they were in the process of utilizing these facilities as also part of their tactical operations center, as again, it was chosen to bivouac the 81st Stryker Brigade in this facility to save money. Therefore, they did not have to get hotels and rent out parking lots for the purposes of establishing the living areas and logistical areas, and also setting up portable buildings and public parking areas or lots and the like, as they could do it here, as many units rotated through here on training, and now it could be utilized as an installation, even if temporarily, until these forces ideally could be sent out to bolster security at the international airport, power plants, water and sewage treatment plants, the air installations such as Randolph and Lackland, even possibly bolstering the Scientific Defense Industrial Base that was at the former Brooks Air Force Base, as it had a triangular-shaped runway on its eastern end of the installation, as well as also a consortium of technology and defense contracting firms now posted up in this area to conduct a public-private partnership with the regime as part of the Defense Industrial Base. They were already being heavily shelled by the Venezuelan forces of their artillery battalion of Otto Malera M56 Italian-made 105mm howitzers that equipped this battalion, as their mechanized infantry battalions were busy clearing the flanks en route to conduct this major operation, as this was one of many key objectives that needed to be overtaken. As all of this was occurring, Randolph was also being assaulted at the exact same time, as was Camp Bullis, as was Lackland, and as were all of these flank clearance operations. Even the Nicaraguan Combat Battalion was busy clearing flanks at this point in time, as the operation was basically underway at full speed. These forces were conducting massive operations and total destruction, making great headway in the process, as the attack helo gunships were now here to stay after dropping off their third and final Spetznas company of the 70th Special Purposes Detachment, which was the Spetznas battalion attached to the 2nd Combined Arms Army. These forces had been barely engaged by the strikers, and they lost nobody in the effort, as the loitering munition strikes, the Ataka ATGM strikes, 23mm fires, and all of the TOS-1A and 155 strikes simply wiped all of these forces off the map. They didn't even stand a chance. Charlie Battery was wiped out by a combo of counter-battery fire, rocket strikes included, as well as Ataka ATGM fires, also 23mm fires from the attack helo gunships firing into their gun line, or what was even left of it at this point, as everything was coming down on this installation. As these forces fled north, they were simply shelled out of existence. As these forces tried to move out of the area down here, they were hit by enormous numbers of Lancet III loitering munitions. As others moved this way, they were destroyed by the shelling and TOS-1A strikes that all wiped this entire area out. Loitering munitions had intercepted these personnel, and shortly after the events of this map, which lasted about 30 minutes, the maneuver elements making it to the western and southwestern end of the installation were effectively now moving in and again engaging wayward and scattered and confused American forces in combat, as the very powerful T-72B3M main battle tanks with their 125mm main guns, which they had new guns compared to the original T-72s, were firing very potent ammunition types into these strikers and simply wiping them off the map, as they were guided by the ISR and AI real-time battlefield data processing system, as they also had their loitering munitions on AI target seeking mode overhead, seeking out targets throughout the battlefield. The anti-tank company within the armored battalion of the 30th Motor Rifle Brigade, equipped with the very advanced BMPT Terminators, were on the move also, smashing their way into the installation and engaging and wiping out American Striker vehicles, such as this Striker that in the back had been completely wiped out by the twin 30mm autocannon fires coming from this BMPT Terminator as it rolled through into this facility, as others smashed their way in elsewhere and were moving in. They were firing their Ataka ATGMs as well. As these were very powerful forces moving into the area, there was little that could be done to stop them in a comms down and ISR down environment, as all these vehicles were completely no match for the T-72B3Ms that had full loitering munition support, total ISR dominance, and heavy firepower that simply couldn't be matched as these forces rolled into the area and basically dominated the battlefield. As again, they were on the outer periphery of the installation to avoid friendly fire incidences, as the mass shelling was continuing by the point of the opening of the western end of the installation map. They could only move into certain areas, and they had to stop as missiles and heavy shelling and the PLAAF airstrikes from the last pair of JH-7s was now coming in full force, as the JH-7s had to wait for the AI real-time battlefield data processing system to clear them in order for them to be able to drop their gargantuan payloads onto this battlefield area. Also, Iskander tactical ballistic missiles were coming in, as were Lancet III loitering munitions in large numbers, also DH-10As, and now, as the clock struck 2 a.m., they were being joined, as this map opens up at 2 exactly, they were being joined now by the container-based supersonic cruise missiles. They were not hypersonic, but they were supersonic, as in they broke the sound barrier, the Chinese YJ-18Cs and the Russian Calibers, or the Club Ks. They flew in with a vengeance and slammed into their targets, as the battalion, the first of the 161st, was completely present on this map. This is a 1.5 mile by 1 mile battle map, as the previous map was a 2 mile in terms of scale east-west and 1.5 mile north-south map. This map was slightly smaller, but it was being hit by concentrated firepower from Russian 152mm artillery from their 2S-19 MSTA battalions. Some of their firing batteries were firing into this end of the installation, as well as Chinese airstrikes already beginning to impact the area and wipe out much of the 1st of the 161st. Alpha and Bravo batteries of the 2nd of the 146th were also present on this map, as they, including Alpha Battery, which was the last battery of the 2nd of the 146th that was to transition to the M777s, like so. This is Bravo battery. The Alpha battery still had the very potent M109A6s, which were the self-propelled howitzers known as the Paladins, the M109A6s. They also had the Fast Vs, which could carry an enormous amount of shells along with the howitzer. They could carry almost 100 shells, each Fast V, and the gun could carry even more when added to the Fast V. As all of these forces were moving through the area of the Alpha battery as well as Bravo battery already having had been established, as again, all of these forces before the invasion had kicked off were conducting training operations. These were training buildings in this area. A Chinese DH-10A strike had landed here and annihilated a building that was right here, as well as severely crippling this one. And artillery strikes from the Russians had already landed and destroyed these forces in the process, including these dismounts. As these were the container-based cruise missiles, and some of these were DH-10As. And some of these were YJ-18Cs. These are Russian calibers right here. These four coming from a single container, as a single container can carry 4, and they can either launch at the same target area or different targets entirely and go different ways as per their targeting data, but these 4 were heading for targets in this area. As the Chinese aircraft, the last pair, getting clearance to drop their enormous payloads of their JH-7 aircraft, were now dropping between them roughly almost 40,000 pounds of air-to-ground ordnance. They had already dropped some of their thousands of pounds of payload from this aircraft here and this aircraft here, which simply annihilated these campsites and everything that was underneath these blast icons of the air-to-ground munitions, also destroying personnel and vehicles like these strikers on the periphery. These were striker platoons of one of the striker companies belonging to the 1st of the 161st. Alpha and Bravo battery were present as well, as again, this was Alpha battery moving through this area, and loitering munitions and heavy Russian shelling was coming into this area, simply wiping these forces out, along with the Chinese airstrikes in this area, hitting also other howitzers and Fast Vs that were beneath these blast icons, and personnel and other vehicles as well, because also in this area was the Alpha Company and HHC, or Headquarters of Headquarters Company, of the 181st Brigade Support Battalion. All of these forces, due to the sheer destruction unfolding all around them, were simply in a state of mass panic and mass confusion. Tactical ballistic missile strikes, such as these Iskanders, were coming down to hit key targets, as, again, between the edge of this map and the edge of this map, 300mm strikes had annihilated a 3 by 3 mile box. It was an enormous area that was destroyed by 300mm Tornado S battalion fires, as well as also into that area, the same area, 122mm concentrated fires from the Russian rocket battalions of the BM-21 Grad battalions within the 385th Guards Artillery Brigade, also the Morava battalion of 122mm rockets within the Serbian Army's 1st Brigade, as well as also, of course, all of the heavy howitzer-based firepower being fired all throughout the area, as even the howitzers would also adjust fire and pound other areas and simply rake an area up and down with howitzer fires, as what was being done in this area was essentially just that. These were massed howitzer fires into this area. All these vehicles on the periphery were destroyed, along with everything beneath these blast icons. As this map opens up, these blasts are occurring from massed howitzer fires coming from the 2S19 MSTA firing batteries that were firing into that area in particular, as well as also this area. These personnel on the periphery, gone, completely gone. Throughout this area, there's a lot of steep, high ground. There's also a large drainage ditch that runs through this area. There are gravel roads that run into training areas where, when personnel train in these maneuver grounds, they can set up their talks and their campsites and everything else. And there's also training facilities. This range road led into this parking lot where these training buildings once existed. There's a training building along this range road here, coming from the other side of the installation, coming from the center of it, moving south into a bit of the installation off to the south. Within this area alone is the armored battalion of the 30th Motor Rifle Brigade. They are operating in this sector of the installation. To their north is the Combat Engineer Battalion with its 7 combat engineer companies, which were like elite assault infantry again because of all their experience with storming enormously fortified areas, some of the most fortified areas ever in the world, ever seen in the Great Eastern European Proxy Conflict. And they were operating to the north of the Armored Battalion, who was operating in the center west of the installation. To the south, the Mechanized Infantry Battalion was operating with its 6 mechanized infantry companies, its headquarters and support company, and its heavy mortar company, consisting of the 2S12 Sani mortars, which were the 120mm heavy towed mortars, towed by a Gaz 66 truck typically. And these were very powerful fire support weapons. The mortar company, with their heavy mortars, were effectively the fire support company of the mechanized infantry battalions within the 30th Motor Rifle Brigade. And again, the mechanized infantry battalion, as well as the combat engineer battalions, had also their headquarters and support company, which were their logistical and command elements, which also assisted by firing loitering munitions, just as did the headquarters platoons of each and every mechanized infantry company, as each headquarters platoon, again, had a single system of the 5-rail systems that were track-based, that fired the loitering munitions, the Lancet 3s, as between each platoon of the headquarters platoons of each combat company having a combat drone section or squad with one system alongside of the combat drone platoon at the battalion level in the headquarters and support company, they were able to effectively get a large number of these loitering munitions airborne at a single time. Although the Chinese only had loitering munitions at the battalion level because they didn't need them at the company level because they had such a large mass firing system, as they had the TEL-like 48 tube system. They could get 48 CH-901As in the air at the time. The Russians did it differently, but it didn't make it any less effective. They just did it differently. They just had to use more systems throughout their forces than did the Chinese. Some might say it was less efficient that way, but it really made no difference because the result was the same. There were large numbers of loitering munitions airborne at one time. So it was not any less efficient than the way the Chinese had it. It was just different. That was all it was. And the Russians, even though they did it differently, were still highly effective in this case, as their loitering munitions were scoring enormous hits and destruction upon the American enemy forces of the Russian formations as they moved through the installation guided by their ISR and real-time AI battlefield data processing network, as they cleared the routes ahead of them with their very powerful T-72B3M main battle tanks equipped with their 125mm main gun, which was capable of firing ATGMs, by the way, as well as their potent 12.7mm heavy machine guns on the turret, as well as a 7.62x54mm coax. And they were joined again by their company of anti-tank forces, consisting of the BMPT Terminator anti-tank systems, which were highly advanced anti-tank systems akin to the equally advanced Chinese QN506. These were very destructive weapons, and they accompanied the armored infantry forces, which were the mechanized infantry companies within an armored battalion, to give the armor infantry support, and they accompanied the tank-based forces, the tank companies within the battalion. And all of these forces working together were simply devastating, along with their loitering munition support. This one was firing one of its Ataka ATGMs at a target, and this one had fired its twin 30mm autocannons at the back of this vehicle and shredded it to pieces and wiped out everybody inside. As effectively, moving into this area, as this arrow indicates, is a tank platoon along with the headquarters and support platoon following behind of one company. There's already a tank platoon in this area securing this parking lot, as all these vehicles were already destroyed by Russian artillery strikes in the area and this Chinese cruise missile strike rather from a DH-10A. And this was yet another DH-10A coming in to hit a target. This was another tank platoon moving into the area. And this was an entire armored infantry company moving into the area along with dismounted squads, as they had a whole platoon of dismounts. And there were combat medics operating in the area as well with their combat medic trucks, which were their ambulance vehicles effectively, from their headquarters and support platoons of these companies. And they were operating alongside of these squads that were taking casualties as they stormed up on this high ground, as they had already used their quadcopter assets to see everything that was going on in this area, as it was being struck heavily by Chinese airstrikes, which decimated a massive area, as all these forces in this area that are surrounded by red and blue meant that they were hit by all this Chinese air power alongside of Russian artillery strikes in the area as well. And, of course, there were even all of the cruise missile strikes from the Caliber cruise missiles, Chinese DH-10A cruise missiles, and Chinese YJ-18C supersonic cruise missiles that were container-based, that were like the Calibers, also supersonic. They broke the sound barrier. They were not hypersonic, but supersonic. And in this area, along this gravel road that went over this grating that basically covered this very long drainage system through the training areas, they were using this as a trench to get out of the line of fire of the artillery, but it did not work out too well, because even as these forces were getting in, artillery was annihilating them, and they were being intercepted now as the armor moved through this area after these strikes had finished. On this area right here, armored infantry troops had dismounted from their APCs and IFVs, their BMP-3s and MZLBs, and they were moving in their different combat formations, including line formations, into these areas. There was a BMPT Terminator vehicle up here that was going to move alongside of these armored infantry troops and give them mutual support, as these weapons were not only excellent against vehicles and tanks, these were outstanding tank-busting vehicles, but they were also outstanding against infantry forces and also light bunkers and buildings as well. They were devastating, like the QN-506 was. And as they moved into this area, they fired down into these forces, including this one conducting a double-column rolling shield behind their vehicle, their striker. As they were moving in to this area, they were being fired down upon by the armored infantry troops with all of their weaponry, from their riflemen, with even including those with 25mm grenade tubes firing their 25mm grenades. Their riflemen were firing their AK-74Ms, light machine gunners firing their RPK-74s, ATGM operators firing Cornet ATGMs, along with also troops that were equipped with RPG-29 Vampires, which were also very capable anti-armor weapons, especially against a striker. They would annihilate a striker easily, as this one was also destroyed moving into the area. This one as well, and the infantry forces, which would continue moving, would also be annihilated by all of the fire coming from these anti-tank vehicles, which were between these vehicles and between these vehicles, and the vehicles moving into this area along with the anti-tank vehicles, all firing at these forces. As the others that were in the ditch were being hit by loitering munition strikes, they could not escape the fire coming from up here, which was, after destroying these forces, a classic L vector of fire tactically. It was superbly executed with great precision, and these forces on the periphery of this heavy 152mm shelling from the 2S-19 MSTA firing batteries firing into this area simply wiped these forces out, and all the forces that were beneath these blast icons. It must be understood at all times on this map that the entire 1st of the 161st Battalion, which was a Stryker battalion, it was a mechanized infantry battalion of Stryker forces, Alpha and Bravo batteries. This was Bravo battery, part of it. The rest of it was destroyed in this airstrike right here. All the rest of their howitzer forces and their trucks, their towing vehicles, which were also their shell-carrying vehicles, these were also annihilated, these howitzers, and these howitzers were next, including these forces that were up on the high ground. They would be hit by strikes from Russian loitering munitions moving into the area, as well as also the Chinese airstrike coming in at the same time, as these loitering munitions were quick when they honed in on a target. As this tactical ballistic missile is coming down, it's moving actually off the map and on the other side of this range road where there's another building that hadn't yet been struck and was about to annihilate it across this road, across the parking area. And it was about to be hit by this tactical ballistic missile and annihilated. As again, it has to also be understood, the mechanized infantry battalion, as 3 full battalions are attacking. The armored battalion is operating in this area, including the additional 2 tank companies of the battalion that were further back and securing the rear areas, as well as the headquarters and support company of the battalion, which was the logistical and command elements over the whole battalion, which were enforcing the logistical resupply operations and commanding these forces in action. As the real-time battlefield AI data processing network was fully influencing the command decisions, of course, of all of these major maneuver forces, of course. And as the air power came in and decimated a massive area of forces, including off-map, all of these bivouac sites, the living areas that were beneath these blast icons, including all the Russian artillery strikes, everything was simply wiped out. These training and administrative buildings by these parking areas, this was a range road, this was another range road, and again, these roads ran through the installation. This was one in the south that would bend and go further south. The drainage ditch ran through this area. There was steep high ground. All of this area in this particular 1.5 mile by 1 mile map was ideal training grounds. It was thickly wooded terrain. It was very steep terrain, and there was a lot that maneuver forces could practice in this area, including even artillery forces. As again, all of these forces had been equipped with live ammunition because they anticipated being redeployed after they had bivouacked and temporarily set up their campsites in this area for their units. Temporarily, that was at least the plan, and to leave at least the major command elements behind in Camp Bullis to command the forces that were out in the field once they got their deployment orders. These places were ideal for training, and as all these forces had been given live ammunition, they were able to try and defend themselves, but by the time they had tried to ascertain where enemy forces were, including these artillery forces, they had no ISR assets. They did not know the exact positioning of these Russian forces, and thus could not effectively fire on them, even if they wanted to, with these M777s and these howitzers that were moving through the area. All they could have done possibly was direct fire if they could have seen Russian forces move into the area, but even so, they would have put their own forces at risk, which were now being pummeled by loitering munitions, cruise missile strikes from Russian caliber Club K cruise missiles, as well as also the YJ-18Cs from the Chinese, and DH-10As, which were the long-range and very destructive and accurate cruise missiles that were subsonic, while the YJ-18C was a supersonic Chinese cruise missile. The DF-100 was a hypersonic cruise missile that China had, but again, YJ-18C was a very fast cruise missile like the Russian caliber. And as these forces moved into the area of the armored infantry, they were moving in double column formations within their squads, as this entire company of armored infantry had moved up a pathway on this steep terrain which could actually accommodate their vehicles, their BMP-3s and their MTLBs. They found an area that the grade of the slope was not too rough for their vehicles, where they could actually get up there, as did their infantry forces make their way up. And as they assaulted this area at the same time as their loitering munitions were coming in, the Americans had tried to return fire vigorously, and they would cause KIAs, as these were 2 squads of armored infantry This was one squad of armored infantry that made it up in a line formation, and this was 2 more squads of armored infantry, and this was the rest of the entire company's worth of vehicles and all the dismounts that were inside that could be deployed out of these vehicles. These squads fought these troops in here, and they fought the troops up here, and they were firing across the way until the vehicles got up and took over for them and destroyed all these forces in conjunction with artillery fire. This happened very fast when these vehicles entered the scene and got up here along with the troops. This was very fast, all this fire, and they held their fire once their vehicles bent ahead of them after they had first cleared the way by clearing these forces with 25mm grenade fire and laying down heavy suppressing fire while this squad was firing up to give mutual support to these 2 squads that were firing at these forces. They were firing up at these forces on this steep terrain right here, as the loitering munition also came in and hit these forces while these other ones hit these forces, and then they bounded into this area and engaged these forces while these forces engaged them. As these forces had tried to flee and come up this high ground, what happened was they were attacked by a loitering munition and these 2 Russian squads. One came up this way in a line formation, another this way, to form an L vector of fire, and as these forces came in, they fired at them like that, as well as the point men on the end firing at what was left of these forces after they got hit by a loitering munition strike. It was tactical excellence on the part of the Russians, and as the Americans, again, were highly confused and scattered forces, they couldn't really be blamed for the outcome. It was natural because they were going to be destroyed by the enormous airstrikes, which were simply gargantuan, as each of these aircraft is dropping 10,000 pounds. Well, this one is dropping 8,000, and this one's dropping 10,000. And they've already dropped the rest of their payloads onto these areas, which were massively destructive. They destroyed everything in this radius, and we're about to destroy even more, such as these forces moving into this area right here. All these forces were about to be decimated by the Chinese air power, and also Russian artillery strikes as well, and tactical ballistic missile strikes coming in to hit major bivouac locations, as there were some more tents off this map that were all guided in by the ISR assets of the coalition forces, the high altitude and quadcopter assets of these maneuver elements, like so. They were scanning the entire area, mapping it all out in real time, as each and every solitary vehicle crew and dismounted squad had their own quadcopter assets, typically operated either by a trained drone operator within their squad or by their NCO himself. And as these forces also monitored their combat data links through their NCO, they could see where all other friendly forces were at all times, as it was like a beacon. And so could the loitering munitions on their AI target-seeking mode, so they knew where it was safe to strike so that they didn't cause harm to their own forces. It was a revolutionary new way of fighting war with the real-time AI battlefield data processing system. It made warfare far more deadlier for the opponent, and it made it also far more safe for the friendly forces to avoid friendly fire incidents. Certain actions and maneuvers could be conducted that never were before. This wedge formation moved down here to support this tank platoon, as another tank platoon moved in and held its position right here on top of this ridge line. While this tank platoon and these anti-tank vehicles, these BMPT Terminators there were 2 Terminator platoons out of their 4 combat platoons from the anti-tank company. One platoon had their forces spread out to assist the armored infantry company in that area, one of 2, as the other was operating in the south, and also supporting the 2 tank companies operating in this area. One tank company on the higher ground, as again, they had 2 platoons here, and 2 more platoons would move in. Our armored infantry troops were filing out to come with the armored forces moving into this direction, as they would assist in destroying all of these forces on the other side of the drainage ditch. They were advised not to cross the drainage ditch due to the high concentration of continued artillery fire, but they simply laid down massive fires on the other side of this ditch, as heavy artillery and more came in and wiped out all of these forces with loitering munitions, the airstrikes that came in already, tactical ballistic missile strikes, The incoming cruise missile strikes, which by now had already hit their targets as soon as the map opens up, as did the cruise missiles, the tactical ballistic missiles, as did the airstrikes, but the artillery strikes were continuing to come in, as the imminent strike markers indicate. There were even repeated fire missions fired on the same areas. So, as loitering munitions also came in, and the fires came in from the tanks directly across the drainage area at Amer1can Forces, all of this concentrated firepower ended these forces. It simply ended them. They were done. All of it was far too heavy, and they could not survive it. And everything, again, that was within a 3 by 3 mile box was outright annihilated by the concentration of rocket fires that came in on those forces from the Tornado S Battalion, as well as the 122 millimeter battalions, which there were 2 of the BM-21 Grads, and also the Serbian Morava rocket battalion, firing again in support of the Russian forces, hitting in this area and in the 3 by 3 mile box that separated this area from this area. By the end of this battle, as all these forces were panicked and in a state of total chaos and confusion, the 1st of the 161st Alpha and Bravo batteries of the 2nd of the 146th and Alpha Company and HHC, or headquarters of headquarters, of the 181st Brigade Support Battalion, were completely wiped out by the concentration of all the ground-based fires coming from the tanks, coming from the armored infantry forces, and coming from the anti-tank forces, in this particular map at least, and all of the loitering munition support, the massive artillery fires, the 2 airstrikes coming from the pair of JH-7s, which dropped, again, a combination of 40,000 pounds of air-to-ground ordnance on this humongous area. Again, this is a 1.5 mile by 1 mile area. This was an enormous area that was covered by these PLAAF aircraft that simply annihilated everything in its path in this entire area, right throughout here in this massive area. It was all wiped out by thousands of pounds of air-to-ground ordnance, plus the tactical ballistic missile strikes, and all of these cruise missile strikes coming in from the YJ-18Cs, Club Ks, or the Caliber, Russian supersonic cruise missiles, YJ-18C also supersonic, DH-10A cruise missiles, and more. This was a DH-10A strike, again, that annihilated a building that was right here, a training building, and decimated this one, while artillery got all these forces before the tanks even rolled in, as they had destroyed vehicles that, again, were isolated and like lone wandering vehicles on the perimeter of the facility. They simply outright annihilated them as they moved into the area, and that applied to all 3 of the maneuver battalions, whether it was the Armored Battalion of the 30th Motor Rifle Brigade, the Mechanized Infantry Battalion that was allocated for this operation, or the Combat Engineer Battalion of the 30th Motor Rifle Brigade that was also allocated to this operation that was operating to the north. All of this was simply overrun. And again, they were advised to hold their positions to the west of this drainage system, as all of this area was being heavily annihilated by all of this firepower from coalition forces. And all the remaining units and stragglers were completely wiped out, with very few survivors, such as those that hid in drainage culverts and found also crevices and rocks along some of the jagged terrain in the area, and there were other lucky survivors of all of this mass destruction, but they were shell-shocked and they simply surrendered to the Russian forces as they knew they had no chance. As this was a massive battle full of enormous destruction from all of these different systems, it was far too much for the Amer1can forces to contend with effectively, and they were simply annihilated for it. And the Russian forces claimed victory after the turn of the 2nd hour into the 3rd, as, again, this entire operation would last, including the battle damage assessment or the mop-up operation, it would last almost 3 hours in total, but the major combat operations, as mentioned in the previous installment, would end well before then. So, after all of this destruction took place with some follow-up artillery fires, along with all the fires coming in from these maneuver elements, from their tank guns, from their ATGMs and 30mm autocannon fires, from their 100mm fires, 30mm fires, also 12.7mm heavy machine gun fire, and all of the dismounted forces weaponry, including some of their ATGMs like the Cornets. All of this and the loitering munitions were simply too much, along with all the missile strikes, artillery, and air strikes. It was over quickly, and this action, the entire way through, lasted nearly an hour. It lasted longer even than the actions occurring on this 30-minute long engagement and the 14-minute long capture of the airfield that was actually 30 minutes before the opening of this map, because they had to shuttle in the second and third companies, which took about 30 more minutes. As artillery was already coming in between these areas while that was even happening, the artillery continued to be fired into those areas as each of these operations was going on either side of the installation. It was a massive operation. Camp Bullis was a huge installation, and the forces were well spread out and had to be dealt with accordingly, and they were dealt with. They were dealt with harshly and swiftly because they could not be allowed to materialize into a potential threat that could possibly throw a wrench in the entire external invasion component's plans to race deep inland. It has to be understood, San Antonio was the first of the major key nodes along I-35, and as such, it needed to be captured exceedingly fast. There was no time to fool around, as the saying went. Everything had to be done in short order and rapidly. So before 3 a.m., Camp Bullis had fallen. In the next video installation of this sub-series of the hypothetical invasion documentary series, utilizing fourth-generation warfare doctrines and real-world everything, in the San Antonio battle, occurring concurrently to Camp Bullis and Lackland, was the operation for the Randolph Air Force Base, which will be covered in the next installation of this sub-series of San Antonio, of the Battle of San Antonio. More to come in the next videos.